So, I'm really going to need to vent about this emotional roller coaster of a day. If anyone is going to get it, it's you all in the child-free community. Honestly, I know I did the right thing, but the emotional weight of all of this has been a lot to process. It feels good to talk it out here, especially because I know you all get where I'm coming from. Alright, let me give you the gist of it. A former friend of mine, let's call him Dave, not his real name, who I haven't spoken to in almost 3 years, reached out to me today. He said he's in a bit of a jam. His house is going through an emergency situation, and he needs a place for him, his wife, and 3 kids to crash while they get everything sorted out. Now, keep in mind, this is the same guy who told me, years ago, that he couldn't be my friend anymore because, as someone who's child-free, I was a bad influence on his family. Yeah, that's what he said. A little backstory, Dave and I go way back. We've known each other since grad school and spent a lot of time together doing all sorts of things. We were part of a pretty close-knit group of friends, and for years, we do fun stuff like renting out lake houses for weekend getaways or hitting up winter lodges for skiing trips. We shared a lot of great memories. Then things kind of went sideways. About 3 years ago, I was going through a rough patch. My dad had just passed away, and in the span of just a few months, I was also dealing with some other personal stuff. I was at rock bottom. And instead of offering a shoulder to cry on or just being there for me, Dave pulled away. In the middle of my grief, he told me that my being child-free was somehow a bad influence on his kids and that he didn't want me around anymore. It hurt, honestly. This was someone I had been there for, someone I had supported during tough times of his own. When he found out his mom had cancer, I was there. When she passed, I was there for him, too, and for his family. But when it was my turn to need a friend, well, apparently, I wasn't useful anymore. I felt completely abandoned, especially because at the time, I was dealing with so much sadness. Fast forward to today, and here I am, reading a text from Dave on my phone. I hadn't blocked or erased his number, so it still showed up when he messaged me. I hadn't heard from him in ages, so to say I was shocked would be an understatement. The message was simple. He needed a place to stay. His water heater had broken, and it was an emergency. They needed somewhere to stay while the issue was being fixed, and he thought I'd be the one to help. Now, let me tell you, I was floored. This is the same guy who once told me I was a bad influence because I'm child-free, and now he wants me to take in his wife and 3 kids? That didn't sit right with me at all. I wanted to understand why he was reaching out to me after all this time, so I asked him, why me? Why now? His response? He was out of options. Apparently, no one else had room for his family, and they couldn't afford a hotel because of all the medical debt they had from their youngest child, who had to spend time in the NICU when he was born. Now, I know that kind of situation is tough. I really do. But here's the thing that bugged me. Why would he think I'd just drop everything and open my home to them, especially after how he treated me all those years ago? And, honestly, why was he acting like a hotel was such an impossible option? I told him I understood that it was a hard situation, but I was still curious. Why me of all people? He told me that he remembered how I helped out some friends last year with emergency housing, and he thought since I had extra space in my home, I'd be generous again. This took me by surprise. He was talking about a situation I had gone through the year before, which was actually pretty delicate and personal. I had a college friend named Kate, who has lupus, and she got really sick when she caught COVID-19. She was pregnant at the time, and things got really complicated. She ended up in the ICU, and her husband had to make the heartbreaking decision to prioritize her life over the pregnancy. Kate's mother, who, I should add, was pretty terrible, didn't think Kate's life was worth saving without the baby, and tried to make it a whole drama, even bringing a priest into the hospital room. Kate made it through, but the whole situation was incredibly traumatic for her family. Her brother and his wife, who lived out of state, came to town to be with her, and since I live nearby, they stayed with me for a couple of days while they figured things out. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do, and honestly, they're some of the best people I know. Afterward, Kate's brother and his wife posted about how grateful they were for my support on social media, sharing a few pictures of my cat and a plant I had in my living room. I didn't realize at the time that the post would end up having any lasting impact, but apparently, Dave saw it and took note. When I asked him about it, he said he'd seen that post from Kate's family and thought it was a sign that I was someone who would be willing to help out again. He said he figured I'd have no problem offering my home to him and his kids in their time of need. I won't lie, my first instinct was just pure anger. The audacity of this guy. Not only was he trying to guilt me into taking them in, but he was acting as if nothing had ever happened between us. No apology for the awful way he treated me years ago. No acknowledgement that he once told me I was a bad influence because of my life choices. Now, when it was convenient for him, I was supposed to welcome him and his family into my life like nothing ever happened. I told him exactly how I felt. I told him that being child-free means I don't want to have kids around in my home for an extended stay. I'm not going to change my entire lifestyle just because his family is in a tough spot. And frankly, I wasn't going to risk having his kids in my house for days on end, especially knowing how people can sometimes take advantage of a situation like that. You let someone stay for a few days, and next thing you know, they're claiming tenants' rights and making it hard to get them out. Dave didn't take that well. He called me selfish, told me I needed to think about his kids, and said I was being unreasonable. He even threw in the whole "my kids need hot water" argument. I told him to figure it out. If it was such an urgent situation, he could use a credit card or ask a relative for help. I wasn't about to sacrifice my peace for his convenience. Of course, Dave wasn't done. He threatened to blast me on social media, telling all our mutual friends how I refused to help a family in need, how I was heartless and cruel for not letting his kids have a warm shower. But here's the thing, I don't really care what he posts. I'm not on Facebook, so I wouldn't even see it. And even if I did, I know my real friends would laugh at him. They'd see right through his manipulative act. So I blocked him. That was the last thing I said to him. How he used to be a good person but had completely changed, and how sorry I was that he'd become this version of himself. I ended by telling him that I couldn't have someone like him in my life anymore. Now, I'm just waiting for the fallout. I'm sure there will be some people who will try to guilt me into helping, but I know I did the right thing. My two best friends, who are both child-free like me, were totally supportive. They were shocked at how brazen Dave was, and they both agreed that his whole story seemed off. One of them even mentioned that her water heater broke recently, and it was fixed within a day. No big deal. So, the whole water heater emergency thing was just too convenient. I can't say it hasn't affected me emotionally, though. I had a lot of good memories with Dave, and it's sad to think about how much he changed. But when I look back at how he treated me, especially during such a difficult time in my life, I can't help but feel like I dodged a bullet. It hurts, but I know I did what I had to do to protect my peace. Anyway, thanks for reading if you made it this far. I just needed to get all of this off my chest. By the time we hit the third house where Dave and Shelly were staying, things were getting tense. They just couldn't seem to find a house, and no matter how much they complained about it, their situation wasn't getting any better. Dave kept insisting that they wouldn't adjust their expectations, no matter what. It was like a matter of principle for him. They didn't want to even look at homes that were the same size as their old one because for them, the whole point of selling that house was to upsize, right? It was about getting a bigger home for the family. But the reality? They couldn't even get close to winning any of the bidding wars. The housing market was crazy, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't catch a break. Dave's refusal to budge on the budget didn't help either. And honestly, I get it to some extent. They just had their third kid, and the baby was born prematurely, which landed them in the neonatal intensive care unit for a while. Medical bills were piling up, and I know that kind of stress can make anyone dig their heels in when it comes to spending money. Dave wasn't keen on taking out any more loans, and he definitely wasn't willing to stretch the budget further. So there they were, living out of other people's houses, bouncing from one place to the next. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it was starting to feel like they were going from house to house like a traveling circus. At this point, I'm guessing even Dave and Shelly were getting sick of it. It felt like they were on the brink of overstaying their welcome, and there was some palpable tension whenever they'd arrive at the next place. But still, they kept searching for that elusive, perfect house. Things reached a boiling point when some people started suggesting they should wait for the housing bubble to burst and maybe consider renting an apartment for the time being. I mean, it made sense, right? The market was nuts, and waiting it out could be a good idea, especially since rents were lower than trying to buy in such a competitive market. But no, Dave wasn't having it. He shot down the suggestion, insisting that renting an apartment was just throwing money away. He'd rather keep staying with people for free, or even live in a hotel, than pay for an apartment. It was so frustrating to hear him rant about this, especially when you consider how he was already shelling out so much money for hotels. I mean, the cost of staying in a hotel long-term was way more than what an apartment would have been. But for him, it seemed like staying in a hotel was preferable because there were no leases involved. He liked the idea of being able to leave at any moment, as though that would make things better. And then there was Shelly. Oh, Shelly. She wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea of an apartment either. She was all about making sure the kids had space to play. She didn't want them in a cramped apartment, she said. She was already upset enough about the fact that they didn't have a backyard anymore, and now this? It just wasn't going to fly. Things got even worse when the family had to leave the place they were staying at again, and This time, there were no options left for free housing. People had started running out of space for them, and the ones who had been generous enough to host them were now needing the rooms for their own families. It was around the holiday season, and everyone was gearing up to have their own families over, which meant Dave and Shelly were running out of options fast. Now, the only free housing they had left was Dave's brother, who lived 2 hours away, or Shelly's parents, who lived 6 hours away. Neither was a great option because of their work and the kids being back in school. Dave's family really needed to stay in the city to make sure the kids could attend their in-person classes. And so, as much as they hated it, they ended up booking a hotel. Let me tell you, if you think living in a hotel is glamorous, think again. Especially when you have 3 kids who are anything but quiet. The hotel staff kept nagging them to keep the noise down, which only added to the frustration. Dave and Shelly kept going off about how unfair it was that they couldn't find a house and how the hotel life was just beneath them. Even though, technically, they could afford the hotel. Sure, it was more expensive than renting an apartment, but that didn't stop them from whining. It was hard to feel sorry for them, honestly. I mean, sure, it was a crappy situation for anyone to be stuck in, but they had the means to make things work. Still, they'd rather complain about being stuck in a hotel. Shelly would post online about how sad the kids were that they didn't have a backyard to run around in. She was feeling sorry for them, for herself, for the whole situation. It was hard to watch. Then, things took another strange turn when I stumbled across something on Shelly's social media. It was a post from the start of the pandemic when everything went haywire, when people were hoarding toilet paper and canned goods because everyone was freaking out. At the time, I'd gotten a message from someone I used to go to grad school with, someone I had been friends with years ago. She reached out like she was checking in on me, but it quickly became clear what she was after. Food. Apparently, she knew I kept a well-stocked pantry and a chest freezer full of food, a habit I inherited from my grandma, who lived through World War II, and my mom, who carried on the tradition. So this friend of mine, let's call her Sarah, contacted me to tell me she needed food because her kid was a picky eater and she was running low. She mentioned how she knew I had chicken in the freezer. At first, I was just a little confused. But then, she had the audacity to ask if I could just give her some. I couldn't believe it. She told me it was because her son only ate her homemade chicken nuggets, and I was supposed to just hand over some of my frozen chicken to help her out. I was already frustrated, and I told her straight up, if you're really desperate, there are food banks where you can get food. I wasn't about to give away my groceries just because her kid was picky. It was panic buying, not a real food shortage. If she just went to the store early in the morning, when they restocked, she'd find plenty of chicken. She didn't take it well. Sarah called me selfish, saying that I was hoarding food while there were people who needed it. I couldn't believe her nerve. And it turns out, she went to social media to talk behind my back about it. Shelly, of course, was in the conversation, agreeing that I was being selfish for not sharing. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like Shelly had a weird opinion about me. I had helped Shelly and Dave's family out before, when things were tough. They stayed at my house for a bit, and I even went out of my way to make sure they were comfortable. But here Shelly was turning on me. She was all about being generous to people when it was convenient for her, but when it came to me, she couldn't even see how much I'd helped her family before. It all came to a head when, just a few days ago, Shelly posted something on social media that sounded like they had finally found a place to live. She talked about how cute it was and how it had a big kitchen where her kids could have space to run around and play. I had to laugh because not long after that, Dave texted me out of the blue. He told me that they had a broken water heater and asked if he and his family could stay with me for a few days while it got fixed. Let me make one thing clear. I had no interest in letting them back into my home. After everything that had gone down, I wasn't about to open the door to them again. I hadn't heard from Dave in 3 years, and now he was trying to play the sympathy card with some made-up water heater issue? Yeah, no. Not happening. Naturally, I said no. And that's when things took an even more bizarre turn. Shelly and Dave started making passive-aggressive posts online, talking about how awful society was now, and how people weren't willing to help out families in need. Shelly was getting sympathy from her friends, talking about how their kids were so disappointed that their new house had fallen through. Meanwhile, Allison, one of my close friends, who had been there for me during all this, got in touch. She'd seen Dave's post about the water heater and had already shared the screen grabs of it. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who saw through his story. Allison and Laura both started calling them out. It was like a social media roast of Dave and Shelly. Allison also reminded everyone about the time when Dave had called me a bad influence on his family. She brought up how I'd always been there for people, how I'd helped them in grad school, and how Dave had never done a fraction of what I'd done for others. Things snowballed quickly. Dave was being called cheap, manipulative, and a total leech. People started sharing stories about how unpleasant it was to have Dave's family stay with them, how their kids were terribly behaved, how they ate everything in sight, and how dirty they left the house. People who had let them stay in their homes before came forward, furious about how much extra work they had to do when Dave and Shelly overstayed their welcome. And I wasn't the only one who had seen through Dave's manipulative behavior. Even his own brother was disgusted by how he was treating people. His brother remembered how I helped them when their mom passed away, and he said their mom would be rolling in her grave if she knew how Dave was acting now. It was crazy. I couldn't believe how everything had unfolded. And then, of course, came the final straw. Dave had the audacity to tell me he was going to blast me on social media. But honestly, he ended up getting blasted himself. He thought I wouldn't be able to prove he was lying about the water heater. Well, surprise, he couldn't keep his lies straight. In the end, I decided to send Dave one final text. I unblocked him and let him have it. I told him exactly how I felt about his lies and how much he'd ruined our friendship. I let him know I wouldn't be doing him any favors ever again, and I wished him the best of luck finding a stable place for his family. And then I blocked him again. For good. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but at the same time, it left a weird taste in my mouth. How could someone I once considered a friend be so manipulative? How could he have thought I would just let them back into my life after everything? But at least I knew I'd made the right call. I felt a sense of peace after that, even though I knew it would take time for everything to settle. There was no way I was going to let someone like Dave walk back into my life and mess with me again. He could take his family and go find a place that suited them, just not with me. And that was it. No more Dave. No more Shelly. Just me, finally putting an end to that chapter. It's been a few months since I cut ties with Dave and Shelly. At first, I felt this strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief because I knew I'd done the right thing, but guilt because, well, it's always hard to let go of people you once cared about, even if they've shown their true colors. But with each passing day, I grew more confident that I'd made the best choice. The truth is, they had pushed me to the point where I had no other option. Then came the news. I was sitting in my living room one Sunday afternoon when I got a message from Allison. She had never been shy about sharing her thoughts, so when I saw the long message she sent me, I braced myself. The words that hit me were harder to digest than I expected. Dave's life had gone off the rails. Shelly had finally had enough of his behavior. Apparently, after the fallout with me and all the people who had turned on him on social media, things had only gotten worse. He couldn't hold down a job because he'd burned bridges with nearly every contact he'd ever made, and without Shelly's support, things had started unraveling quickly. It wasn't just about the broken water heater or the endless string of excuses. It was his complete inability to take responsibility for his actions, to admit that he was part of the problem. Shelly had tried for years to make it work, to keep the family together, but Dave's refusal to change had finally taken its toll. She had left him. I couldn't believe it at first. Shelly? Leaving him? But it all made sense when I thought about it. Shelly wasn't one to complain loudly or make scenes, but she'd endured a lot. She had to shoulder the entire burden of parenting while Dave checked out, blaming everyone else for his problems. The end came when Dave had nowhere left to go. His brother, the one person who had stood by him for so long, had finally cut him off, too. Everyone had. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. And that's when the loneliness started sinking in, that kind of deep isolation that no one can truly understand until they're in it. He had burned all his bridges, and the people who were once willing to help him had moved on. I heard from others that Dave's life became a downward spiral from there. He ended up moving into a rundown apartment in a questionable part of town, far from the suburban dream home he'd once been so obsessed with. Shelly took the kids and moved into a small house on her own, doing everything she could to give them a normal life. She didn't want to be a part of Dave's mess anymore. She told her friends that it was better for the kids to grow up in a stable environment, without the constant chaos Dave brought. I don't think anyone could blame her for that. A couple of months after that, I found out that Dave had lost his job at the small hardware store he'd been working at. A few weeks later, he was caught up in a legal issue involving unpaid rent and some other debts he'd accumulated. It was like his life had just spiraled into one disaster after another. He kept trying to hold on to this image of being a hard-working, family-oriented guy, but in the end, he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. Then came the truly heartbreaking part, the final blow. Dave had gotten sick. I don't know if it was the stress or something else, but he ended up in the hospital. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he had been admitted for complications related to an untreated illness. It wasn't something that could have been fixed quickly or easily, and by the time the doctors figured out what was wrong, it was already too late. His health deteriorated fast, and just like that, the life he had been clinging to came to an end. I remember feeling a strange mix of emotions when I heard the news. There was a part of me that wanted to feel sorry for him, but the truth was I didn't. He had brought all of this on himself. Dave had been given chances over and over again, and he had refused to change. He had hurt people, pushed away friends and family, and thought he could get by with nothing but lies. In the end, all he had left was a trail of broken relationships and broken promises. Shelly, for all her faults, was finally free from his grip. She was starting over with her kids, trying to rebuild the life she'd put on hold for so long. As sad as it was, at least they had a chance at a better life. For Dave, though, there was no redemption. His story was one of stubbornness, pride, and missed opportunities. It's hard to feel sorry for someone who constantly refuses to change or take responsibility for their actions, no matter how much the world around them crashes down. Maybe, in some ways, he never really understood how much he was pushing everyone away. Maybe he thought he was invincible, that he could keep skating by without facing any real consequences. But in the end, the consequences were inevitable. It was a lonely and tragic end for someone who had the potential to be so much more, but chose instead to dig his heels in and alienate everyone who cared about him. I won't say that I ever fully forgave Dave, but I do understand, in some way, how his life ended up the way it did. It's a sad reminder of what happens when you let pride and stubbornness rule your decisions, when you refuse to listen to those who care about you, and when you think you can burn every bridge and still have a way back. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for him, but it was the one he'd earned. I guess in the end, we all have to pay the price for the choices we make. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.